President of Village in the Valley. My name is Dr. Teresa Gatling, and I want to share with you our mission. Our mission is elevating and uniting the Black community while connecting the cultures of the Rio Grande Valley. What I'd like to do now is ask Mayor Garza if he would like to have a few words.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so very much. I appreciate the opportunity to just be here with you, even though it's virtually. I was looking forward to, seeing everyone and, doing a welcome in person, but I completely understand and I appreciate y'all doing this, at least to have it virtually. So my name's Ramiro Garza and I serve as mayor for the city of Edinburgh. It's a true pleasure to just join y'all this evening. My role here is to say welcome. But I do plan to stay on and listen in on the discussions. Such an important day. I spent earlier today, I saw Sabrina earlier today with the Juneteenth committee celebrating the Day of Service at Restlawn Cemetery. That was such a neat event. So good to see so many students there, because I think that's what this day is about as well. It's a day of service, as well as recognizing the efforts by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all the fight that he had for fighting against discrimination and equal justice, but it was also a day of service. So for people like me that are now serving the community, I keep that in mind. And I just want to thank each and every one of you that is here today and is taking part in this. Thank you for your efforts and everything that all of you do, and making sure that, we do not forget Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mayor Garza. We appreciate your being here and that you're choosing to stay along with us. So thank you so much. So what I'm going to do, moving right along, I am here to introduce our speaker who's going to give us kind of our historical perspective on voting and Civil Rights Act and Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I'm going to ask Natasha Altima McNeely, who's a professor at UTRGV, if she would kind of introduce herself a little bit, give a short bio, and then please continue on with your discussion. And if you do need PowerPoint or anything, let us know so we can make sure that we give you the ability to share.
Thank you. Yes, I do have a PowerPoint.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, I guess share your screen.
Oh, great. Thank you. All right. I guess before I get started, as Dr. Gatling asked me to do, my name is Natasha Altima McNeely. I am an associate professor in political science, as well as an executive committee member of the Center for Survey Research and Policy Analysis at UTRGV. And I'm very honored to have been invited to be a part of this wonderful event. And so I'll just take a few moments to provide the historical background leading up to the Voting Rights Act. And then I'll also talk about some contemporary challenges that have resulted from some of these legal challenges against the Voting Rights Act. So just as a quick overview, during this, I promise, brief historical discussion, I will first begin with some historical events that led to the creation and ratification of the VRA. Then I'll talk about the components of this particular law. And as I mentioned, I'll discuss some of the legal challenges. And I'll end with a discussion of some of the ongoing consequences of the legal challenges. And what I didn't put on the outline, but that I will also discuss, is actions that all of us here can take in the continuous fight to retain and expand voting rights. So just to begin, during the period of Reconstruction, which is recognized as the period right after the Civil War, so 1865 until about 1877, 3 amendments that are referred to as the Civil Rights Amendments were ratified. So of course, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. It prohibited slavery, except as punishment for crime. And for those of you who follow the debates surrounding our criminal justice system, this particular portion of the 13th Amendment remains problematic, right? This exception in the form of punishment for crime. By 1866, we saw the passage of the first Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, it was challenged by then President Andrew Johnson. So he vetoed it twice. And on the second round of vetoes, Congress, the Republican-controlled Congress at the time, were able to override the second veto from Andrew Johnson. And then it was formally ratified in 1870. Moving on to the next Civil Rights Amendment, we see the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. And essentially, it provided citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States, including the former slave population. Specifically, those who were born in the US were recognized as citizens, and they were given equal protection under the law and due process. In 1870, we see the 15th Amendment was ratified, which guaranteed the right to vote. And it would and also stated that the right to vote would not be limited or removed based on one's race, color, or, quote, previous condition of servitude. Now, at about 1877, in which I said the Reconstruction ended, we see the period referred to as Jim Crow beginning. And before I get into that, I will quickly mention what were referred to as the Enforcement Acts, which was actually the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And these Enforcement Acts intended to help enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So by 1875, we see post-Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow, which, as we all may be aware, Jim Crow extended all the way through the 1960s, which I'll mention throughout the presentation. So we see that Jim Crow and in this era of segregation was a long period of disenfranchisement of African Americans, Hispanics, and other racial minority groups, which was at many points legally supported by the judiciary across all levels of government, including the United States Supreme Court. Several prominent tools used by many states, in particular southern states, to disenfranchise the groups that I mentioned included violence, intimidation, poll taxes, literacy tests, annual registration. Here in Texas, one of the other prominent tools that was used was what's referred to as the all-white primary. And there were also the use of economic threats and other means. We see that up until going to about 1954, this was recognized by many as the beginning of what was referred to as the Civil Rights Movement. And many argued that the official Civil Rights Movement ended in about 1968, although we can argue that it's still ongoing. Many of the pursuits of the original members and leaders of the Civil Rights Movement continue today. So, of course, many prominent leaders included the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as the late Representative John Lewis. And one of the many important points about the Civil Rights Movement, but that is essentially key to our discussion of voting rights today, is that during this period, the news media began showing images of police brutality and other forms of violence towards people fighting for civil rights. These images helped not only gain more public, but also political support for laws that were created and intended to protect the civil rights. So some of these more early laws included the following, which are the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and the Civil Rights Act of 1960. So we see that the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was actually the first civil rights law passed by Congress since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, or that were also referred to as the Enforcement Acts. And this particular Civil Rights Act allowed the Attorney General to sue on behalf of people whose voting rights were denied. And moving on to the Civil Rights Act of 1960, we see that one of the components was that federal laws were allowed to appoint referees in order to hold voter registration in places where votes were being denied to various groups. It also allowed for the federal inspection of local voter registration polls and punished anyone attempting to violate people's right to vote. Until, or going to about 1964. So very briefly, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was signed into law by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then he also signed the one in 1960. By 1964, of course, we are in the period after John F. Kennedy is assassinated, but he actually began the pursuit of this particular Civil Rights Act, and it was finished and actually signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. And this particular law outlawed all forms of public discrimination, and it also encouraged the U.S. Attorney General to participate in lawsuits against state governments that encouraged racial segregation. And some other quick facts about the Civil Rights Act is that, unfortunately, despite the intentions of members of Congress at the time who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we see that, unfortunately, the powers to enforce that particular law were weak, but they were actually supplemented over time. And another interesting fact about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was that over time, it was intended to protect the rights of people based on their race, color, religion, their sexual orientation, as well as gender identity. So we are now at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which from this point on, I'll refer to as the VRA. So much like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the VRA was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. And primarily, it's intended to complement and help enforce the 15th Amendment. We see that it essentially, many of its components attempted to outlaw Southern states from requiring various means of preventing people from voting, including literacy tests and some of the tools I mentioned earlier. Now, there are a few sections which I would like to highlight because these particular sections were legally challenged within the last decade. So first is Section 2, in which it's argued that the state and local governments cannot promote laws that prevent racial minorities and language minority groups from voting. Section 4, one of the components of Section 4 is the requirement that states with language minority groups provide bilingual ballots. And then we also see Section 4B, which identified a formula which was used to determine which states would adhere to the next section, Section 5, or what was referred to as the pre-clearance section. So essentially, Section 4, with this that portion of Section 4, through the formula, identified several southern states, including Texas and portions of Florida and other prominent southern states, as well as various counties throughout the United States, which were flagged as having passed egregious or over-the-top laws or rules that prohibited people from voting. So over time, since its passage in 1965, the VRA has actually been amended or extended, if you will, 5 times: 1970, 75, 1982, 1992, and 2006. And across these various prominent amendments, we see that these amendments included the extension of the coverage formula. It made the ban on tests or devices used to deny the right to vote nationwide, and by 1970, this particular element was actually permanent, so it's a permanent ban. By 1975, regarding the portion of Section 4 which which called for the providing of bilingual ballots for language minorities, we see that the 1975 amendment actually expanded the meaning of the phrase language minority to include Asian Americans, American Indians, American Natives, and those of Spanish dissent. The 1982 amendment created what is referred to as majority minority districts. And some of you may be saying, what does this have to do with voting? Well, it actually has a lot to do with voting, especially in the area where we are now. So our congressional district, or the Valley, has three prominent congressional districts: District 28 to the west, District 15, and then District 34 to the east. Each of these districts are referred to as majority minority districts or majority Hispanic districts. And their existence is due to the amendment of the 1982 amendment or extension of the VRA. So essentially, a majority minority district is a congressional district in which the majority of residents are a racial or ethnic minority, and it ensures the election of an African American in majority African American districts, or Hispanic in majority Hispanic districts like 28, 34, and 15 to the US House of Representatives. And why this tool was necessary is that when you look at the composition of Congress from its inception, so from the first Congress, which took office in 1789, all the way through the 1960s, you'll notice a pattern. And the pattern is that most of those members were white men, and typically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant white men, some Catholics sprinkled in, but mostly white, non-Hispanic white men. And so it wasn't until the 1960s into the 1970s that you see some women entering Congress, you see some Black men entering Congress, and then you also see some Hispanic men entering Congress as well. So the idea behind majority minority districts was that it would be a very essential tool that would allow the minority the minority members concentrated in each of those districts, a representative who looked like them. And so this concept is descriptive representation, which argues essentially that the representative would look like or share background characteristics of the voters that he or she would be representing. Unfortunately, there have been some prominent legal challenges against majority minority districts. And I can answer, I'd be more than happy to talk about these cases in detail, but for the sake of time, I will just go show grandma and grandpa. Go show grandma and grandpa. Sorry, that was my little one. So I will be happy to answer more questions about each of these cases, but for the sake of time, what I'll say is that each of these, so the Shaw versus Reno, Miller versus Johnson, Bush versus ViVa, these were Supreme Court cases in which the legality of very specific majority minority districts were debated. And essentially, the majority minority districts that were being examined were viewed as unconstitutional. And since we're in Texas, it will be of some interest to you to know that Bush versus ViVa was examining 3 majority minority districts here in the state of Texas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are some cases where there's been some cases which have challenged the legality of other parts of the VRA. And Shelby County versus Holder 2013 essentially ruled the 4th, so section 4B which is the coverage formula, which again identified states that had to pre-clear or get permission in order to they had to submit their proposed electoral rule changes, and if it was viewed as being discriminatory against certain groups, then it would not be able, these laws would not be able to be enforced. So in Shelby versus Holder, we see that the United States Supreme Court says the coverage formula is unconstitutional. And then unfortunately last year, the Branovich versus the Democratic National Committee argued that essentially section 2 is also unconstitutional. We see some other prominent ongoing consequences of these legal challenges. So of course, we are aware that Texas first some of you may be aware that Texas first created or enforced a voting ID law in 1990, but it was revised in 2011. So from 2011 through 2021, we see that this revision of this law was legally challenged. And in 2014, we see one of the more prominent rulings against the voting ID law being made. So by the time we got to September of 2021, we see that it was ruled that the state of Texas was required or is required to pay the plaintiffs who first challenged this law in 2011 $6.8 million in legal fees. However, the voting ID law remains on the books. And of course, there are more contemporary or ongoing efforts, if you will, to limit voting rights. And so one of which is SB 1 here in the state of Texas, which passed last year, and SB 90, which passed in Florida last year as well. Really quickly, another ongoing challenge continues to be efforts by the Republican Party here in the state of Texas to remove and limit the existence of these majority-minority districts. So what I'm showing you is the current congressional map. And as you can see towards the bottom, you'll see districts 28, 15, and 34, which again are the congressional districts here in the Valley. So what I'm about to show you is the first map that was presented last year of the proposed redistricting. And what Republicans have done, and so you guys may be thinking like, I actually don't see that many changes. Well, the changes are very subtle and the impact of those changes are actually quite significant. So one prominent change is that of the 8 existing majority-minority Hispanic districts, it has been reduced down to 7. And I believe at the time there were about 2 African-American majority African-American districts, and now there are 0, right? And so the number of all white or majority white districts went from 22 to 23 under this proposed change. So very quickly, we see that there are ongoing efforts to combat these more contemporary efforts to remove or limit people's rights to votes, one of which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which essentially is trying to restore the power of the Voting Rights Act that Shelby versus Holder and Brenovich versus the DNC removed. And then we also see the For the People Act, which not only tries to expand voting rights, but also is trying to limit the influence of money in campaigns, block partisan gerrymandering, and make new ethics rules for federal politicians. We see that both of these bills have passed the House under the Democratic majority. However, they have yet to gain enough support despite the Democratic majority in the United States Senate. So after all of this, negative news and negative reality, what can we do? The first thing we can do is to get informed. Please start learning about efforts to remove and limit the right to vote and what it means for communities like the Valley. Contact your state senator or state House member, as well as your United States Senator and United States House representatives. Let them know what issues matter to you. Let them know what you want them to do. In the context of voting rights, tell them, support the John Lewis bill, support the For the People Act. Make your representatives and senators aware that you care about these issues and that you're watching what they're doing. And then also to get involved. There are many organizations that are fighting for efforts. They're fighting the efforts to remove the right to vote, and they're trying their best to help people get mobilized. People who, for instance, don't have access to a valid ID to vote in states like Texas. They're trying to help them find the resources they need in order to get the tools that they need to vote, and they're trying to help people become informed. So it's very important that all of us here get involved with these organizations or start movements of our own to support candidates who will support our right to vote. And I will be very happy to answer any questions during Q&A, and I've included some sources. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. That's what I have to say about that. That was incredible. I think more history than perhaps any of us thought we were going to get tonight, but I am really impressed. There was a lot of information, and I'm very grateful that you were able to share it with us. She's asking if anyone has any questions. I suppose we should allow someone to ask questions right now before we move into our next area. So if there's any questions, either state it in the chat or come off mute. I'll give you a few seconds. If I don't get anything, we'll move on to the next thing. This is my Jeopardy music. I'm just singing. I'm swaying to it.
Teresa,
Okay, yes.
Teresa, can you please make available to us the last slide that she put up there with the, resources for, getting involved with voting rights, and make sure that that's available in the chat box or something so that we can get that?
So, Miss Natasha, would you be able to do that? Either send us the whole presentation would be great if you don't mind, or at least that last slide, so that we can make sure that everyone who's here tonight will have access to that. So
Definitely, I'll send it to you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you, Deb, for that question and
I
observation.
have a question, and Dr. Natasha, I know you went into it a little bit, but maybe I lost it. But can you tell me a little bit more about the cases that is rolling back, what we're trying to recover with John Lewis Act?
Sure. The first one was Shelby County. So it's Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. So Eric Holder was the former Attorney General under Obama. And this was the ruling came down in 2013. And essentially what the argument was, the Supreme Court, well, the conservative justices made the argument that the United States Congress, which originally passed the law and it was signed into law by LBJ, but the argument became that the United States Congress could not force states to follow the pre-clearance section. So they could no longer force certain states or certain jurisdictions to have to get permission in order to enforce proposed laws, electoral laws. And so the justification was literally that things are better and it's no longer necessary. And so building on that idea, Brenovich versus the Democratic National Committee, in the case that was argued last year, the Supreme Court, again, the conservative majority, argued that Section 2, which originally intended to say that voting rights could not be denied based on race, color, and the like, that this provision was no longer necessary, and that the courts were no longer, or there was more flexibility in any level of courts determination that an action related to voting or that was alleged to have denied the right to vote, there was more flexibility in the court's determination of that. So that actually weakened the Section 2 portion of the VRA significantly. And so Democrats in the United States House, and specifically the members of the House who drafted this bill, right, they're trying through the John Lewis Advancement Act and through the For the People, well, in particular, the John Lewis Act, they're trying to help the VRA regain its power to hold states and jurisdictions responsible.
My name is Alyssa Cole. I am currently an anchor and reporter for KRGV Channel 5 and a member of ViVa. I am so happy to be moderating for you all tonight, and I'm just reading off my notes here. But before we begin, I would like to remind everyone, if you can just place your microphones on mute while everyone's speaking. Of course, if you are unmuted, you want to have those cell phones on silent. So of course, I'm going to introduce first Dr. Francisco Guajardo, the CEO of the Museum of South Texas History, and Dr. Natasha Ultima McNeely. You all are familiar with her presentation. She works at UTRGV for the Center of Survey Research and Policy Analysis at the College of Liberal Arts. So before we call on everyone, I would like everyone to just remember who their reporters are. So I will call on the reporter, and I will extend 3 minutes to each panelist to discuss the Voters' Rights Act, redistricting, and gerrymandering from where you are and with your groups. So of course, now I would like to call up Table A. So if you just want to, mute and chat with your partners there. So Table A, reporter, if you would like to share your discussions and viewpoints that arose.
Alyssa, 1 minute. What we'd like to have happen first, and I don't think we actually got this changed to you, is to have Dr. Guajardo, since he has not had the opportunity to speak, to introduce himself and kind of speak on his platform or anything he would like us to know regarding especially the historical aspect of the civil rights or voting rights here in the Valley. Miss Dr. Natasha, I think, has already done so we may not need her to do that. So if Dr. Guajardo, if you could maybe say that first before we go into our table and breakout room discussions.
Dr. Gatling, a question for you about how much time should I take to do that?
We put 3 minutes, so I don't know if that's enough time.
Do you
need to go beyond 3?
Okay, because there's 3 minutes and then there's 3 like Guajardo minutes. those are akin to biblical minutes, that I can.
All right.
Let
me
but
ask my timekeeper.
I'm happy to do 3 minutes. So, I think that Dr. McNeely did such a good job of covering the history. Let me just time myself here. I want to make sure that I'm disciplined with this. So I will show a few slides just to kind of help to contain myself. And so I was going to do a little bit of what Dr. McNeely did, but I will not do all of that. But I will say that voting in this country, to me, is kind of like a mirror of American history. And so that, I wanted to touch on like what the Constitution says about it, and then what the Constitution means, and, who wrote the Constitution and for whom, right? There's that famous book in 1913 by Charles Beard, An Economic Interpretation of the American Constitution, where he points to the 55 founding fathers and looks at clauses in the Constitution and argues that each one of those 55 men, white men, were protecting their own property. And that's what the Constitution actually lays out. That's a compelling argument. And so within that, we also have the 3/5 clause. So what does that mean? That counts certain people in this country as 3/5 of a human being. And so for representation, for voting, that sort of thing. And then Dr. McNeely did a really, really superb job of looking at the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Amendments. And then she jumped to the Civil Rights Act, I think rightfully so, and the Voting Rights Act of 65. But I do want to say the 24th Amendment, which abolished the poll tax, is one that hits close to home. And so the poll tax is something that every South Texan can relate to if they're old enough. My wife's grandmother, who was born in 1912, used to keep her poll tax receipts. The poll tax should be called, though. The poll tax was part of the reaction. So the mirror thing here, the mirror metaphor thing, is that for everything that's been passed, legally, there's been a reaction to it. Like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, what's the reaction to that? Well, the reaction to that was Jim Crow. What's the reaction to the 24th Amendment and poll tax? And what's the reaction to civil rights in 1964 and voting rights in 65? We've seen in the literature that there's this movement to build a new Jim Crow, which is almost like the institutionalization of a new way of being, sending Black men to prison, for example. So the whole incarceration movement is a reaction. All these things are reactions. The Shelby case that really begins to strip at the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the Shelby case makes pre-clearance not the law anymore. Pre-clearance, imagine that, pre-clearance. That means that if there's improprieties in voting of any local place, you need to first be pre-cleared to create that new provision, pre-cleared by the federal government. Well, the US Supreme Court said no more pre-clearance anymore. So the Voting Rights Act has no teeth anymore. That is huge. I wanted to touch on a little bit of a South Texas context. You know, because South Texas has been ruled for many, many years, really up until like boss rule was sort of punctured early to mid 20th century. Although, you know, one could guess that there's still boss rule in South Texas, but it's much more sophisticated and nuanced. But boss rule is when the big names like the James B. Wells, the Mario, the Guerras in Stark County, the Klausners in Hidalgo County controlled politics here. I'm talking about from the 1880s all the way up to the 1930s and 40s. And the way they controlled politics was by controlling the Mexican vote. How do you control the Mexican vote? You control it through the poll tax. So whoever has a lot of Mexicanos who can vote, you figure out a way to make them vote or to have them be eligible, and you pay their poll tax. So whoever could pay for the most poll taxes would typically get the kind of legislation they wanted. And so because Dr. McNeely was on the call tonight, and because so many of us are connected somehow to Pan Am, to UTRGV, I'll just tell you the story of Edinburgh Junior College. When it was founded in 1926, in 1927, it opened. It was opened, it created because of two bond issues that were passed in 1925 and 1926 on the weight of the Mexican vote, on the weight of the poll tax. So there were two bond issues that were passed in 25, 26 that the politicos sort of managed, and the big politico at the time was A.Y. Baker. There's a Baker Street here. There's also a Klausner Street. So Klausner was, you know, the sheriff for a long time. Baker was then the sheriff, and they sort of, you know, switched roles. So these guys were savvy politically, and they knew how to get the vote. They did it by raising the money or their own wealth to then do something. In this case, to build a college. The way they built the college was through the Mexican vote, through the poll tax. There's so many stories that are rooted in South Texas lore that are so ensconced in the history of voting in this country. Now, more recently, you know, what the Republicans are doing in the state legislature now is passing laws to prohibit the right to vote. So the extraordinary work of the county judge in Houston, for example, is what created a backlash. The backlash was against extended hours for voting. The backlash was against mail-in voting. The backlash was against all of those things. If a lot of people of color don't vote, there is no backlash. When a lot of people of color vote, you get a backlash. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the attack on Shelby. And when you can stack the court with like-minded people, you can actually attack the history of civil rights. And so I'll just end by saying this. So when Dr. King wrote his book, Why We Can't Wait, this is based on the letter that he wrote when he was incarcerated in the Birmingham jail. And so the imperative that he pointed out was that we have to take action. It was his call to action in this historic book. And to be honest with you, I don't know that things are going to change. There's going to be a continual stripping of voting rights unless people take action. But that really has been the American way. So we don't take action. I don't think things are going to happen. I'll just end with this. For a long time, like slavery, for instance, was so much a racist thing to be sure, but it was also an economic thing. So for a long time, who could vote was an economic function. Something happened after the Civil War, when the economic argument in a macro scale began to shift to a cultural argument. There's a lot of Black folks now stripping voting rights away because of a cultural argument. There's a lot of Latino folks now stripping the right to vote because of a cultural argument. It's not an economic argument anymore. Now it is some economic and it is cultural, and it is embedded within the new body politic. It's very sophisticated, and the right wing has been planning for years, since the Goldwater Revolution, when the American Heritage, the Heritage Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, and there's been think tanks that have been for the better part of a half century now created to raise young people to believe in these ways. It's a whole education. And so unless there's an antidote to this, and there isn't a good one, things will continue. This cultural argument will continue to grow. And then you can't even have a filibuster, to undo things, because there's a powerful cultural argument. And the argument is in South Texas, it's all over the country, and we've seen how it's all over the world as well. I'll end with that. 8 minutes. Dr. Gatling, I'm sorry, but you
That's
gave me 8
okay.
minutes.
It was fascinating. We have thoroughly enjoyed hearing that. I'm like, darn, can we hear more? But you're not done yet. So we are asking you, as well as Dr. McNeely, to be around to have this discussion along with us as Alyssa brings up each breakout room, and we talk about what we've discussed. We are asking for your input, things that you all might have to add to that, or it's speaking from, you all have such a wealth of information. So as our panelists, that's what we'd like to have happen. So Alyssa, you may continue.
Yes, thank you so much. So reporters, just a reminder here, when you all are called on to speak, you have 3 minutes to speak. So if you just want to take this time right now to just review your notes as I go over the question here. So we will start with table A. So table A, reporter, if you just want to go ahead and get your notes prepared there as you prepare to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and touch on the question for table A. And table A, your question was, what steps must we take to ensure that human equality and cultural distinctions are consistently acknowledged, valued, and fully integrated into the social, economic, religious, political, and educational consciousness and behavior of elected and community leaders? Reporter A, you can unmute your microphone and you can speak now.
Who is table A, so I can find you to help unmute
It
you?
was Francisco Guajardo was going to report for us.
Oh, do you want me to talk again? Okay.
Yes.
I'll report out. So this is what was talked about in my group. The diversity is necessary. Equality is necessary. Diversity is a human right. The question was, how do we get to that? And so there were some big questions posed by our group. Questions such as, how do we bring people with different ways of thinking to the same spaces? And so, somebody in my group was very thoughtful about this and was actually quite in angst about this, because she wanted to know, how is it that we puncture that wall of intolerance? I don't know how to do that. And so there was, I think, a good dialogue in our group, about how to do that, how to build bridges, especially when people are sort of like, they retrenched to their own corners. And so I think that in my group, it was really a plea for tolerance and for the creation of spaces so that people can be in good, robust, kind of dialogical, experiences. And so that was kind of the thrust of what my group talked about. Imayu, is that fair?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to table B. So reporter, for table B, if you want to prepare your notes here as I prepare to read your question. And this is a question for table B. Are there health-related disparities in our community? And if so, what are they? And what actions must be taken to eliminate these disparities or inequities? What advocacy is necessary to mend the fractured system of inconvenient access, unaffordability, and differing standards of quality in healthcare for the most vulnerable among us? And reporter B, if you would like to unmute your mic, you can speak now.
Yes, hello, everybody. Our group was talking about healthcare disparities along a number of different lines, and that could be physical health, but also mental health as well. We had talked about increasing community awareness of domestic violence, suicide prevention, also increasing healthcare literacy across the board. It was very important for us to discuss meeting patients where they are at, individuals where they're at in the community. One of the ways in which this could be achieved is discussing matters of health prevention with individuals in places where they are. So that could be an example of a promotora group that goes out to the communities and discusses healthy diet, lifestyle changes, emphasizing wellness, improving health literacy, and looking at it from a prevention standpoint and also making it increasingly accessible. That's been curtailed somewhat because of the pandemic, but that's something that could and should continue. We were discussing some screening programs that have taken place in the past at the Pulga in Alamo, where individuals, anybody who is interested could come in and get a free hemoglobin A1C screening. And then also, if they were found to be diabetic, receive free urine test to determine if they also had diabetic kidney disease. And the emphasis was on detection and prevention of long-term consequences of, in some cases, a disease that individuals didn't even know that they had. It was discussed also that we could look at improving overall wellness and kind of getting people reconnected with nature through the AgriLife extension, other things that had come up regarding resources that individuals need to help reduce healthcare disparities and improve outcomes could be an expansion of the Hidalgo County Indigent Health Program. That's been something that's been very, very helpful as kind of a lifeline to members in the community that simply do not have resources in any other way to pay for basic medical care, be it pharmaceutical coverage, be it meeting with their primary care provider, or perhaps with a specialist in the participating networks. These types of community outreach these types of resources can very well be life-saving. And also, speaking of life-saving, increasing awareness of suicide prevention and domestic violence. I mean, these hotlines are out there, they exist, but there's not a lot of, I guess, awareness at the community level. If a patient comes into our clinics, we'll discuss this with them if the need arises. But I do get the sense that there needs to be, and it was brought up in our group, that there needs to be more of a full court press when it comes to getting that information out to the community. I think I've kind of hit all the points. I don't know if there's anything anybody else wishes to add from my group, but hopefully I did a good job and represented you well.
Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you so much.
Is there anything that either panelist would like to add to that, or y'all are good and we just move on? Because that's the other reason you're here over these discussions. If you have something to add, you may. And if you don't, then no problem.
Yes. One thing that I'd like to add in regards to I guess in the context of the Black community, a very prominent racial health disparity is Black maternal mortality. And so I guess really quickly, it's very dangerous for women to give birth here in the United States. And when you're looking at how the US compares to countries around the world, we're actually quite high on the list, and it's not in a good way. That the rate of death is actually quite high, but it's, the driving factor is Black women. And when you're looking at the rates of death of Black women compared to women of other racial and ethnic backgrounds, Black women drive it almost like 3 to 1. If you're looking at the state level, it's almost 4 to 1. And so a lot of the factors that contribute to Black maternal mortality here in the US broadly speaking, are applicable to racial health disparities that are encountered by Blacks in other health contexts, but also Hispanics as well. So there's lack of access to quality care. There's the sort of minimizing of health concerns by health providers towards their Black and Hispanic patients. There's a lot of race, like the quote that was included as part of the discussion questions from Dr. King was very apt, because he noted essentially that the healthcare system in the United States is racist in nature. And I think one of the ways that this can be, this institutionalized racism can be combated is through the various organizations that exist on the ground that are meant to help address a lot of these racial health disparities. So like in the case of Black maternal mortality, there's it's BMMA, and it's Black Mamas Matter Alliance. And so, by getting involved with these various nonprofits, I think all of us can help fight to create a change, and we can push for, not only the medical profession, but also the, hospitals and clinics to really change how they approach their patients of color, and to hopefully over time take those concerns held by patients of color more seriously.
Thank you so much for that extra additional information. That's very, very important. And I think it's something that not everybody is aware of. So thanks for making that point. Alyssa, I'll stop again.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll move to Table C, the group that I was a part of. And reporter for Table C, if you want to go ahead and prepare your notes here, I'll go ahead and I'll start reading the question now. And the question for Table C was, how do we recognize and utilize our individual and collective abilities and assets or resources to affect positive social change? So Table for Reporter C, you can unmute your mic right now and you are free to speak.
Thank you, guys. And so our group went over the question. One of the things that we said was it was important to recognize the power in our tongue. It's as important what we speak, what we have to say, and that whatever we do say has and impacts people in all the communities and all levels, regardless of color or whatever cultural difference it might be. Another one of the points that came out was that we need to do is raise more awareness of more cultural awareness, that that just because we might not be as Hispanics, that we might not be Black, does not mean that we're not affected by these things, and that the civil rights movement affected everyone, not as minorities, not just African Americans, and to be very aware of that. We're all in the same boat. Another one of the questions that came up was that answers is that that we need to make our stories connect. That we've all faced the same trials and tribulations, that not just that it goes for all of us, that we've all been affected some way, maybe not in the same way, but not in the same fashion, but some way it's all relative to each other. And the thing that I think what was also brought up was education in schools. We need to have that conversation in the schools, helping children understand more about the issue and the actual knowledge of what has happened in the Valley. That there was a cemetery for just African Americans. That it was, that there was that difference, and there was just another thing that came up, and I didn't know this before. There was also plots just for Mexicans, and there was plots for the Chinese or Asians. Bringing that knowledge to them and letting them know what actually happened, and also was maybe using historical tax credits to develop the historical landmarks. Having the actual landmarks, bringing up that issue, teaching our children, showing them those memories, showing them what has happened there and the history behind it, and maybe partnering up with like the museum, the schools, taking them out to tour the places and actually have hands-on for them to see it with their own eyes, that it's of what actually happened. And more or less is wraps it. I'm teaching, and mine was actually, teaching our children, letting them know, actually having that conversation, because I think they don't see how thorough it and what actually has happened and how bad it was. I saw a picture today where it's the little. I'm sorry, on the actual date on the when they integrated the schools, her coming out of the classroom with the two guards, and of actually having lived that, and showing them that it was a reality, and that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I don't know if one of our panelists would like to weigh in. Okay. And I'll go ahead and I'll move on to Table D, reporter for Table D. If you want to go ahead and prepare your notes, the question that we have here in today's tensions over teaching a more accurate account of the African-American Black experience of slavery and post-slavery oppressions in America. What steps must be taken in our communities to ensure that teaching and learning systems for all ages provide unrestricted to a complete and unbiased accounting of the purpose and impact of slavery and its lingering influence and perpetual racism? How can we counteract efforts to distort the truth about the African-American contributions to the development and building of America's past, present, and future? And of course, reporter for Table D, if you want to go ahead and unmute your mic, you can speak now.
I think that's mine. I'm Karina Cerda. I recognize that question. Let me just verify.
That's us.
It's ours? Okay. I couldn't remember what our group name was, but yes, I'm Karina Cerda. I'm a local attorney, and kind of similar to the last question, we also talked about education, but the first thing that we needed to start with was acceptance, especially down here in Hidalgo County. 90% of the population, I would say closer to 95% of the population is Latino. And so most people that grow up here think that everybody, is just like them. I think this past year, I remember hearing people say that they had never experienced racism. They were Latino, Hispanic, Mexican-American individuals that had lived in the Valley their entire lives and never experienced racism. They didn't realize that it existed. They didn't think it was a problem because it didn't affect them. And so our group started by saying that acceptance and acknowledgement that racism is a lingering problem and affects all aspects of our community. And it's as the question states, lingering influence in a perpetual racism. That's true. That is a reality for a lot of people. And it's very important to acknowledge and accept that is a problem that affects people. And just because it may not affect certain individuals does not mean that it doesn't exist. So our group said that we start there, and then the next step would be education. And through education, there's different ways to educate people. What a lot of people I feel don't understand, especially in my community, is that the Hispanic and the Latino population also gained their civil rights through the civil rights movement. As we learned today, a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that all the other minority communities stand on the shoulders of the Black community and their efforts and what they did. And they opened the door for the rest of us. A lot of people don't understand that there used to be signs that would say no Blacks, dogs, or Mexicans. They don't understand that we too were impacted by the same. They seem to have forgotten because they didn't forget, because that this is a problem that affects everybody. And some people think that because they have lighter skin, they're not impacted by racism. Yes, they are. It just impacts everybody. We cannot live in a truly free and equal society if some people, if not everybody is truly equal.
We did speak about in today's era how, we're all suffering mental health, especially the previous administration. And because of that, a lot of us did not want to look at certain news networks because we felt like everything was one-sided and biased, or one or the other, and it was causing us a lot of anxiety, not getting the correct news properly. And so a lot of us, we got our news from social media. And so that's where we would see, because maybe a relative would post something or a friend, and we really didn't want to see the news because it was more, biased or negativity. So we would look through our social medias where we would get our current news. We also realized that the voter registration systems that are out there are very weak. And a lot of people don't register to vote. The main thing that we realized on our group was that people don't get involved because they don't have a personal connection to it. They don't think it's happening to them. You know, a lot of people are very selfish and they won't get involved unless they feel that it's something that's going to help them in the end. And so one of the ways that we thought that it can help all of those things that we touched on was to get a social media campaign